Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Chris, and today's video is a very special video. It was actually recorded in January of 2020 as a podcast. My friend Josh Williams asked me to be on his podcast so we could talk about our mutual love for the movie E.T. And when we got done with the recording, he said that he didn't have a podcast and he wanted to do it anyway and give the audio to me to post on my channel. So I finally got around to editing it, and today marks the 39-year anniversary for the release of E.T., June 11th, 1982. It is now June 11th, 2021. So I decided it was appropriate to put the video up today. It is pretty long. It's almost 2 hours. We talk about E.T. and a few other films, and we go into great detail. So without further ado, enjoy the podcast.
My name is Josh Williams, and I'm here with Chris Cooney. Chris, thanks for taking the time to do this tonight, man.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, I met you through our mutual friend Joel Capilongo a couple summers ago when we worked for him at the Great New York State Fair and his business, Strong Hearts Cafe. How long have you known Joel approximately?
I first knew of Joel back in 1995 when I was hanging out with a few of his mutual friends, but I never actually met him until later on, about 2000 and I don't know, 10 or 11.
Okay, that's about when I met him also. He was living with my friend Jeff Watkins, and I would say it was right about 1995 or 1996 that I first met Joel. How old are you, Chris?
I just turned 44 last week.
Okay, and I'm 42, and I'll be 43 this year, so we're approximately the same age. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk with you is because of the movie E.T. When you and I were standing next to each other at the fair, doing the job, you had mentioned to me that E.T. is your favorite movie.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you some questions about it. Do you remember which theater you saw it at?
Well, I was a little kid at the time, but I believe it was in Oneida, New York.
Okay. Any recollections about that first viewing that you can tap into or bring to mind?
I sat right on the left side near the front with my younger brother and my parents and a couple kids that we babysat.
Okay, that's pretty specific.
Yep.
How old is your younger brother? What's the difference?
Oh, he was born in '78. We're about 2.5 years difference, so
Gotcha.
we were pretty close in
Yeah.
age.
Okay. So that's similar to my experience. I was born in '77. My brother Eric was born in '75. So about the same setup there. And what I remember about it is I was at my grandmother's house flipping through the newspaper, and the movie section was what I was looking at. And for some reason, The Empire Strikes Back was in theaters at the same time as E.T. Now, I know E.T. is released in 1982, and Empire Strikes Back is 1980, so it must have been a re-release of Empire Strikes Back. And the ad was just Darth Vader's helmet there. It was a mostly black square, and that's what I wanted to see. My uncle was there. I don't know if he was babysitting us or what the deal was, but he wanted to take us to see E.T. And the ad for E.T. was just the letters E.T. There really wasn't much of a graphic to appeal to me. And I said, no, I don't want to see E.T. I want to see Empire Strikes Back. And my Uncle Pat made this deal with me. He said, okay, we'll go see E.T. today, and if you don't like it, then I'll take you to see The Empire Strikes Back again. And I was in for a treat. We went to go see it at the Shoppingtown Mall Theater, which was across the parking lot from the mall itself. It was a separate building where the Chili's is now. And I remember my uncle has always had a great sense of humor, and he bought some Raisinets at the concession stand. And he was making this joke about these Raisinets being rabbit turds. And then when the movie starts, as you know, they're going through the forest and he's tagging into the Raisinets joke, had us rolling, but then the movie draws you in immediately from that opening scene. What was, not just in that first viewing, but in the many times that you've seen it since, what are some of the moments of that resonate with you or that connect with you that make it your favorite movie?
All right. Well, one thing that you reminded me of, the reason why we saw it, since I was so little, I was 6, and E.T. came out in 1982 in June. And the reason why we went is because my mom said it was so hot, we didn't have air conditioning, so she just took us all to cool off in a movie theater. And that's why we initially went. I saw it 2 times in the theaters when it first came out. And then I recently saw it last year in the theater again with a symphony playing. And there's so many things that I can talk about that. First off, I really connected with Elliot. I felt like Elliot and me had a lot in common, and Star Wars that he was talking about. At the time of year was Halloween, and I loved Halloween. Riding the BMX, and just everything with the Dungeons and Dragons, everything about that just hit home with me. And so when I look back on it now, those things, it's weird because I love, it's my favorite movie ever, but I try not to watch it too often because I don't want to dull the senses that I have from watching it. Because every time I watch it, it's like a time machine.
Yeah.
And for me, when I say it's my favorite movie, I guess for some people some people might have this as well, and some people might not. But I think a lot of times when people say, "Oh, that's my favorite movie," or "This is my favorite movie," it's just a movie. But for me, when I say E.T. is my favorite movie, it's an experience. It's a feeling of nostalgia, and it makes me incredibly happy and sad at the same time. Happy because I can go right back to that theater to when I saw that, and just knowing it was like a warm feeling, knowing, where I was back in 1982, with my family going to see this amazing movie, and how it made me feel. And it makes me sad because I know I can never go back to that. It's gone forever. The time is gone forever. Even if I was to go and watch it now, I'm watching it in 2020, not in 1982. And watching it then, it was the time. It's a nostalgic time machine back to 1982 of everything I was doing back then. And you mentioned in Star Wars. Star Wars was also part of my childhood, and seeing Star Wars in E.T., that there's so many things in there. And yeah, it made me cry, and for some reason, like, not everybody likes this, but for me, I love movies that really evoke that emotion in you, because, if it doesn't do that for me, like, I'm like, oh, this was a good movie, and then I forget it, like, in a week. But if it really evokes emotion, then I remember that forever. And there's a few movies that I really like that for me, and E.T. is one of them. And I remember when I was little, and I cried in E.T., and I thought at the time, I'm like, I'm being a baby, I can't be crying like this. And so I'm like, well, I'm going to see it again, and I saw it again within the next month or two. We went back and saw it a second time, and I knew what was coming. I'm like, I'm not gonna cry now. And when it gets to, I don't want to give any spoilers, but when it gets to, I think a certain part that everybody would cry, I cried again, and I'm like, how am I, crying again? And then when I saw it last year in the movie theater, it got to that part, and just seeing it come on the big screen at the very beginning, I was like full of emotion, like the hair on my neck was standing up, and watching this, I was so into that movie, and it was bringing me back to being a kid. And by the end of the movie, like, I teared up again, and I cried. And I don't remember the last time I cried except for that. Like, just knowing that's my nostalgia right there. That movie can do it for me. And I don't know. I can ramble on and on about it, but
You're speaking to the very thing that I was hoping you would speak to. When you told me that day at work, and it might have been the first day that I met you, Chris. You said that this was your favorite movie, and you said it in a way that made me take notice. It wasn't just a by the way comment. Like, you were very serious, and I could tell that there was a story to that and why this movie struck such a chord with you. And that's the reason why we're talking about it now, because there's more that I want to know about your connection to this movie. And I feel connected to the movie as well, and I relate to those things that you just commented on. The Star Wars tie-in was something very special about it, and I wonder how this movie came about. And I'll share with you some of the things that I've heard, and you tell me if it lines up with some of the things that you've heard. But we were able to relate to that character of Elliot, and it felt like a very personal connection. I don't think that, although it's a crowd-pleasing film, it's also a very personal film. And when Elliot is playing with his Star Wars action figures, I remember seeing that in the film, and every time that I've seen it since, it's one of my favorite parts of the movie. Those action figures were such a huge part of our childhood and most people that grew up in our era. So for Spielberg and the screenwriter to have this connectedness to what children were into in a very authentic way, it didn't feel contrived at all. It didn't seem like it was a cash grab or capitalizing on the popularity of Star Wars. There's just sort of these touches of Star Wars, like E.T.'s Yoda costume, or not his Yoda costume, but he sees another kid in a Yoda costume. That reference, and the figures. Now, what I've recently looked into since our conversation a couple weeks ago is that the screenwriter is a woman who passed away a few years ago, and I think her name is Marsha Matheson.
Melissa.
Okay. I'm astounded at the hipness of the dialogue. When Elliot is trying to get the other guys to believe him, he uses a slang term that's hilarious. And he says, "It was nothing like that, penis breath." I mean, things like that you wouldn't expect to come from a 30-year-old screenwriter necessarily. Like, it just seems so fresh in the way that we spoke to each other in the early 80s. I also found out that screenwriter married Harrison Ford, and they were married right up until 2004. And I would have to make the inference that they met through Spielberg, that Lucas and Ford and Spielberg and all those guys were around each other making movies left and right. So what do you know, or what's your understanding of how the story was written? I've heard that it was Spielberg's idea and that he was trying to comment on his parents' divorce. I don't know how the screenwriter comes into it, but what have you found out about that?
Yeah, there's a really good documentary called Spielberg, and it talks all about it. Spielberg was really angry. His parents split up, and he was trying to tell this about a boy who lives with a single mom, and parents are divorced, and he tries to tell the story. He doesn't try. He magnificently executes the story through a child's point of view. That's why you see a lot of low angles and stuff like that. That scene that you were talking about where Elliot says it was nothing like that, penis breath, that wasn't in the script. That was something that Spielberg whispered in his ear to get a reaction. Oh. And when you see Dee Wallace kind of laugh like that, that was an authentic reaction.
I never knew that, Chris.
At least that's what I heard. That's what I read.
And it contributes to the authenticity of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they looked far and wide for a little boy to be Elliot, and they looked at hundreds or not thousands, if not thousands, of actors, and then finally they said, "Well, we got one. I think he was in Austin or somewhere in the South Texas or something." And they're like, "Well, we can fly him in and one more audition, and Henry Thomas came in, and he couldn't really tell him too much about the movie or what the movie was about. He just said, well, let's just pretend that there's an alien, but this alien is like your dog. It's like your best friend.
Okay.
And we're the bad guys, and we're taking him away from you. So Henry Thomas, his audition for that was like he nailed it. He killed it. He's like, no, you can't take him. You know, he started crying. You can't take him because he's my friend. He's mine, and he belongs to me. And like they're like, well, you got the job. And right there, he was the perfect for that role too.
Yeah, he really goes for it. And so hearing what you just said about it, it feels like what we see in the movie is probably pretty close to what his audition was in terms of the passion and what he's delivering.
And I hear that. So another one of my favorite scenes, like, I mean, it can bring so much emotion just seeing that scene of E.T. and Elliot hugging at the end when E.T. is he's got all the emotion in this alien that they made in 1981. You know, it came out in 1982. So that scene at the end when they say goodbye, that was all one take, first take for Henry Thomas, and from what I heard.
So
I wasn't there.
Going back to the conversation that we had, and it feels like it was the first conversation that you and I ever had, and it might have been second or third day working, but
no, I only worked there one day each year, so that was the first conversation we ever had.
Okay, must have been. And
I don't think it was at Strong Hearts at the fair. I think it was actually us cutting stuff up at Strong Hearts that night that we went in there, and he asked us to go in to prep food.
It seems to me like it would have been at the fair, because by the time I worked with you on that midnight shift to prepare, I had already been acquainted with you. And I think we were portioning seitan.
Yeah, we were cutting potatoes, I think.
I know that we did that, but whether it was at the Strong Hearts anchor location or at the fair, what stuck with me was just how serious you were about that movie being special to you. And I felt like that was something that I could relate to. That I feel it for E.T. There's some other movies that I have a strong connection with like that, but I knew from the way you were talking about it that it wasn't just, oh, I love that movie.
Right.
That there was a deeper connection to it. And I think that in a larger sense, we're talking about art itself. And I've thought of the purpose of art is to reflect what the human experience is. And I get the impression from you that E.T. reflects your experience in a way that is so on the money, so powerful, and done with such conviction, from Henry Thomas's portrayal of that character to Spielberg's reasons for wanting to make that film. It all just rings so true for you that's why it's your favorite, and that's why I wanted to explore the magic of it. And this conversation is also open to go off in other directions. Like when we talk about Henry Thomas, I am thinking about Cloak and Dagger, and I love that movie also.
David Osborne
is his character in that?
Yeah.
That movie was one that was either on HBO when we were younger or had the VHS, but it was something that was in heavy rotation.
Yeah.
And saw it a lot. And I think it kind of gets overlooked through the lens of time, where movies like The Goonies and Back to the Future and E.T., they're unforgettable and they'll always be there. And the students that I work with in this day and age are familiar with those titles, but they probably don't know Cloak and Dagger.
Right.
Or another lesser movie of that era that I also happen to love is Explorers.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, right? It follows some of the themes and tone of E.T. I think that the studios wanted to capitalize on the success of E.T. because it was such a cultural phenomenon. Um, and then I believe you and I were in communication when the sequel to The Shining was released a couple months ago, and I I gave it a positive review and said that I think you would like it. Have you been to see that yet?
I have not seen
Okay,
it.
so I will not go further into what I wanted to say about that, but I definitely think you would enjoy checking that out. So I went to San Antonio in 2016, and one of my favorite things to do is go to places where movies were filmed, particularly the movies that I love. And San Antonio is where they filmed Cloak and Dagger, and there's a river walk there. The whole city was incredibly beautiful, but it brought me back in that same nostalgic way that you were commenting on. Um, and so Henry Thomas didn't really have uh, a tremendously successful career. It's kind of a miracle in and of itself that he didn't suffer the horrible fate that you hear of with child actors. I mean, he's alive and he's doing all right. A lot of child actors don't make it out.
Well, I was looking into it maybe 5 or 6 months ago, and it's really so. E.T. is one of. I mean, if you take inflation for the time that has gone, it's up there. I think at the time it was the number one movie, the most highly grossing movie of all time, and it still might be with inflation. And to know that, I looked up the net worth of all of the actors, and the only one that has a really solid net worth that it was in that movie is Drew Barrymore.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of sad to know that, like
Right.
somebody like from one of the most loved movies of all time could be like that. The net worth was, I don't know it off the top of my head, but it wasn't very, very high. And his brother was only like,
I'm glad you brought that up too. So one of the things that brings into the conversation is the unlikelihood of this movie being the hit that it was. I mean, if we were to hear the pitch for this movie, it would seem like such a long shot for this to strike a chord with America and the world. I mean, it resonates with people like you and I on a personal level. Like, we feel like that's our movie. But at the same time, it was a tremendous success, and everybody was flocking to see it.
they didn't want to have it made. They're like, no, we don't need another alien movie. We have Close Encounters. We don't need this. And he pitched it, and they didn't want it. And another thing is they went to M&M's to use their M&M's, and M&M said, "Oh hell no,"
Really?
And so they went. So they went to Reese's Pieces, and we all know that whoever said no and M&M's probably lost their job.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another thing. And to piggyback on what you were saying about going to places to see where they're filmed, I also love to do that. And when I was in California, I went to the park where E.T. was filmed, and it still has the the playground there that was in the movie, and I filmed a video there, and I went there by myself, and I just sat down in the grass, and I was just like, I mean, anybody could go sit down there, but like for me, I was like, oh my god,
You got
like
the vibes.
I'm sitting here right now, all these years later, and this is where they filmed my favorite movie. And like I was kind of at a loss for words when I filmed that video, and I took a bunch of pictures, and then I went off over on the cliff, and I could see where they filmed the city and everything. And
Were you by yourself?
I was,
Yeah.
yeah. And I'm the kind of person, I don't usually like doing things by myself, but I had nobody to go with, and so I was visiting California, so I'm like, you know what, I need to do this. So I went there and shot the video, and I just sat there until it got dark out. And the other thing is, because E.T. is my favorite movie, I was at a convention a few years back, probably 5 or 6 years ago. It was a horror convention. I had a table there because of what I do for YouTube, but also somebody was there that, so if I see a celebrity, I've seen celebrities, I've met celebrities, and I'm not the kind of person that you would say would get like starstruck.
Right.
I'm just like, hey, how's it going? Like, and they'll be like, hey guys, I met so and so today. That was pretty cool. But I don't really get starstruck. But Dee Wallace was there, and Dee Wallace played the mom in E.T. And
Sure.
to me, as a little kid, it was kind of my fantasy movie mom. You know,
Yeah.
like that's how I thought of her.
Right.
And I walked by her booth. I was there for 3 days, and I walked by her booth the first time, and there was people around there, and I just walked. I kept walking. And the second day, kind of the same thing. And the third day, there was a little kid talking to her, and so I just kind of like went up to the, I told myself, if I don't do this now, I'll never.
Right.
So I kind of went up to her booth, and I was just looking at all the pictures, because she's in a lot of horror movies. And this little kid is talking to her, and she's talking to this little kid, and he's just asking questions, and I'm like, the little kid's about 10 or something. And then he walks away, and now it's just me, and she just looks at me, and she goes, hi, how are you doing? And I'm like, oh my God, I'm like getting starstruck. Like, and I guess it's not so much starstruck, it's the fact that she's in my favorite movie, and she's talking to me, and I'm like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, ask me any questions you want. Like, I worked with Spielberg, any questions you want. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I make videos. I love movies. I'm trying to make a movie. Like, of course I want to ask you all these questions. Let's think of a question to ask you. I'm thinking in my head, and it went blank. I had nothing to ask her. And she goes, is there any photos that you like? Because you have to buy a photo of her to get, to get her to sign it and stuff. And, obviously there's all these, she's in Cujo's, she's in Lords of Salem, she's in all these movies. And I'm like, that one, of course, I knew it. I didn't have to look at any of these. I knew I wanted this one. And it was her and E.T. And she's like, oh, that's a good one. And she signed it. Be good.
Oh,
Dee Wallace.
Chris, that's awesome.
And then I said, E.T. is my favorite movie. I can't believe I'm meeting you right now. And do you think maybe you could say something on my video for my show? She's, oh, absolutely. And she gets up and she talks on my video, and I'm like, my whole day is made. I can't believe it. And she's like, oh, you could go to my channel and check it out. It's, it's pretty cringy because I did not know how to react to this, but it was definitely a highlight of my day. And so I got a picture signed for, and then I immediately called my brother, and I'm like, Pat, because he saw E.T. with me. I go, Pat, I just met Dee Wallace. Like, he's like, oh, give me one too. So he got one too. And then the very next day, he texts me and says, hey, I'm at the airport. I'm, because he's in the military. He's leaving to go somewhere. He's like, well, I'm at the airport right now, sitting next to Dee Wallace. I'm like, what? I'm like, say something to her. He goes, nah, she's on the phone. I'm like,
Was this around the same time that you
it was the
had
very
met
next day. It was after the convention was over. The very next day, he saw her at the airport, in the Syracuse airport. So,
See?
so he did get to see her, but
That's what I'm talking about,
he didn't
Chris.
talk to her. So, I have a nice picture of me and Dee, and I have got a little video clip of us.
So, I mean,
C. Thomas Howell was there that night too, and I met him too, but I didn't really talk to him.
this is awesome, man. Like, this is a special movie, and in 1982, when it comes out, it's everybody's favorite movie, and it's not unheard of for that to be someone's favorite movie, but great movies are made constantly, and there's a lot of competition. And for that to hold the number one spot for you, I mean, that's what I'm really interested in. And your sincerity and your how genuine you are about this topic, like, that was the thing that made me take notice when we started talking about it. There was a beat and there was a pause in there, so we might have stopped the mechanical work that we were doing for you to give that moment the gravity that it deserves for you. And I thought, this guy's not just talking about everyday fanhood for this. This is a next level for him. And I can tell you're passionate about your projects. So I wanted to find out more of what is there, because the movie has that magic quality and it's special in a way that very few movies are, and it stands alone. There were several movies that came in the wake of E.T. that tried to replicate what E.T. had, and none of them came close. Some of them are really cringy, and I'm sure you're thinking of some of those titles.
Yep.
Explorers, I believe, got the green light because of the success of E.T., but I also feel that it's a different movie than E.T. Explorers was one of those movies like Cloak and Dagger that I rented from the local video store. Similar to the chair that you were telling me about, when that video store went out of business, late 90s, early 2000s, I went in there and I was able to buy the VHS copy that I would rent all the time, so it became sort of this artifact. But going back to your encounter with Dee Wallace, I mean, your reaction was congruent to the place that you hold for E.T., the reverence that you have for it. So, yeah, you've met celebrities, you've met actors and musicians and people in the arts, but your reaction to Dee Wallace was different, and it can go either way. I think you've probably experienced that too, where people say, don't meet your heroes, you'll be disappointed. Because E.T. means so much to you, if your encounter with Dee Wallace had gone poorly, it runs the risk of messing up the movie for you. On that note, I wanted to mention to you before I forget that I went to Portland, Oregon over the summer, and Vinny Pasquarella moved from Syracuse out there, and we went to Movie Madness, I believe is the name of the video store, and they have all kinds of movie props, including Dee Wallace's, was it like a cheetah print dress?
Yep.
I think it's her Halloween night dress. And behind a case right next to a bar of Fight Club soap and the baby carriage from the Untouchables. I mean, really cool video store, which is more of a museum than anything else. But I have had that experience of being in the location where one of my favorite films was shot. And my girlfriend commented on this and my compulsion to travel, and a lot of the time it's motivated by these filming locations. I could go to another state or another country with no better reason than because a movie that I love was filmed there. And her take on it was that she believes what I'm subconsciously trying to do is get as close to the stories that I love as I possibly can, which is what brought me to El Paso a couple weekends ago. And that experience was a great experience, and there were several things about it that made me want to reach out to you, and that's sort of how this conversation and the idea for this conversation came about. Before I get into that, I want to go back a few steps to what we were talking about with the Star Wars items and references in the film. It's not just Star Wars, but there were other things about our world as a kid in the early 80s that show up in an authentic way in E.T. The BMX bikes you mentioned. The Texas Instruments Speak and Spell. I mean, that red one was one of a few different products that they had. I remember there was a silver one, and there was one that the frame of the thing was more blue, and they had a couple different colors, and they did different things. But after E.T., that red one was the iconic one. The brother, you mentioned that his net worth is not...
Well, he became a mailman for a while, and I had a friend, I forget who it was, somebody worked with him.
Really?
Yeah.
Whereabouts would that
I don't
be?
remember.
So when he walks in with his football pads and goes to the refrigerator, he's singing a song. And in 82 and in many years after, when I'd watch it on video cassette, I didn't know what that song was. And in 1992, there was a guy who lived down the street from me. He was 9 years older than me, and he was very much into the arts and would clue me into things that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. We went to the galleries downtown Syracuse, and he took out a bunch of vinyl records from the library, and one of them was Elvis Costello's 1977, 1978 maybe, album called Armed Forces. And there's a song on there called Accidents Will Happen. And that's the song that, is his name Robert Naughton or Robert McNaughton? Is it McNaughton or Naughton?
I think it's McNaughton.
I think it is, yep. And
No, you got me guessing.
no, I think you're right. So he's singing this song, Accidents Will Happen, and it's only after I find out who Elvis Costello is that has any significance to me. So a pop song that a kid is singing, an action figure, a BMX bicycle, a piece of technology, all of these different things that you talk about, the time machine and the nostalgia of it. It captures those things in a way that seems effortless. It just seems like Spielberg, screenwriter, production designer, everybody that had anything to do with making that film look the way that it did, seemed like they were just grabbing what was around, and they capture that moment in time so that it is like traveling back in time when we watch it. And I also appreciate what you said about not wanting to dull your senses to it, not wanting to overindulge in it and take away from that special quality that it has. But the older brother doesn't have much of a film career afterwards. Drew Barrymore has her own interesting story where she had that troubled period of her life, which it seems like a lot of people have forgotten about that, but she attempted suicide, as I recall, the drugs and alcohol, and then tremendous comeback, becomes a producer, and basically calls her own shots in Hollywood. So this trip to El Paso, it comes from the same sort of process that we've just been talking about. There's a movie that I really love, might be my favorite movie. It's called My Own Private Idaho. And are you familiar with this? Have you ever seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I know.
So River Phoenix is in it, and the first time I saw River Phoenix was in Explorers, and then Stand By Me. My Own Private Idaho is interesting in the way that it comes together. It's based in part on a play by Shakespeare, Henry IV, Part 2. Take some dialogue from that. It's based on a song by the B-52s called Private Idaho, which itself is based on the last episode ever filmed of The Twilight Zone, where these kids are trying to get away from their parents' divorce, and they jump into a pool, and when they go underwater, they come out in a river in a peaceful forest, and it's escapism. But the connection here that brings it full circle is Spielberg got his start, from what I've heard, from Rod Serling of The Twilight Zone, allowed Spielberg to direct some episodes of Night Gallery. And so the film takes its title from a song that references a Twilight Zone episode, but the real heart of the story for My Own Private Idaho comes from a book published in 1964 called City of Night. And that title is also where Jim Morrison gets the line in the song LA Woman. So there's a lot of things that are inspired by this book, City of Night. I read it over the summer, and the author grew up in El Paso. And he said that journey through the American city of night should begin in El Paso, in a dust storm, beneath gray clouds like steel doors locking you in the world from heaven. And I never considered El Paso a place that I would want to go. And after reading this book, I felt like I had to go there to see where this art was born. And while I was there, I walk down the street to the border of Mexico, and the city on the other side of the border is Juarez, and it's notorious for being a dangerous city. In 2010, it was considered the deadliest city in the world, with 35,000 murders that year. I might have that wrong. It might have been 3,500, but either way, there was a lot of violence. It has since gotten a lot better, but I walk into Mexico, and I just wanted to get my passport stamped and walk back. But when I walked back across that bridge over the Rio Grande, the U.S. Border Patrol officer with his assault rifle was yelling at me not to come any closer. And I said, I'm a U.S. citizen. He said, it doesn't matter. I said, where do I get back in? He said, not here. And the sun had set, and now it's nighttime in Juarez, and I'm beginning to panic a little bit. Like, am I going to be stuck in here? Is this going to be as dangerous as I've heard? And I walk around Juarez for a little less than an hour, and I get to the bridge where I can cross back into the United States. And the line of people was the longest line that I've ever stood in. And a lot of thoughts were running through my head as I was standing in that line, and a lot about the politics and immigration. And my experience and my observation was that everyone was really polite, everyone was really calm, and no one gave me a hard time. And the way that it connects to this conversation that we're having is through the word alien, and made me think about that word alien and how that word is, I feel, unjustly applied to these people. And I think the effect of it is that it dehumanizes these people so that they're somehow less than human. Other alien tie-ins on that trip include going to Roswell, New Mexico, and it seemed very gimmicky and very much like a tourist trap, how there was a little green alien, the typical image that we've seen since the 1940s. And so I'm thinking about that alien, the sci-fi alien representation, and whether or not there was whatever it was that happened in Roswell in 1947 is in my mind as a mystery. And the contrast between the alien as it's used to describe the Mexicans trying to enter the United States, and the alien associated with the UFO in Roswell. And then I'm coming back towards El Paso through the town of Alamo Gordo, and this is when I messaged you and asked you about the E.T. game that was buried there, and you had a lot of information about that game. And so there was the alien of E.T., the alien of Roswell, the alien of the border, and anything in that you want to comment on, if it's the game or what you'd heard or had seen, or the information that you have about the landfill there.
Well, there's a documentary that I watched, and they talk about it. The guy that made it, he made it in 5 weeks, and he was like the hot shot for making games back then. But that's the game that destroyed pretty much Atari. That was the end of it, and then everybody hated him after that because he had like an impossible time limit to get this done, and the game, although it looks good from the package,
sure does,
because it's E.T. and every kid wanted that
had
game.
to have it.
It just was a horrible game, and it was impossible to play. And I had it, yeah. And anyway, they go through painstaking attempts to try to find out if it's true that they took all these games and buried them. So what they did was they tried to see timesheets of where it would be, because now we have 30, almost 40 years of landfill since E.T. was. So they tried to figure out what time of the year that they got rid of them and where it would be, and they dug and dug, and they ended up finding it, and they found E.T. cartridges.
So Chris, if we go back to that time, now these studios and gaming companies have this down to a science. If there's the possibility of cashing in on a movie tie-in product, be it a video game or clothing or whatever it is, studios know how to strike while the iron is hot. With that game, did that game come out approximately at the same time that the movie's released, or did it come out in the wake of the movie's success, or did it come out to beat a Christmas deadline?
Yeah, I believe it came out to beat the Christmas deadline. E.T. came out in June, and it was like a huge hit.
Yeah.
And they were like, we need to make this game for Christmas sales. This is how long you have to make it. And he's like, the guy didn't sleep. He just was like programming over and over and over, trying to make this game happen. And that was the downfall of Atari.
And his career.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah, people didn't like him. For some reason, they didn't like him anymore.
So I'm wondering what games he had already created that he was the ace, and what was the time crunch. And I'd also like to, after this conversation we can do some additional research, but what was the paycheck for him? Because he walked into Mission Impossible, right? Like, he knew he couldn't deliver a quality game under the time restriction that he had, but he agreed to it. I mean, they probably made him an offer he couldn't refuse financially, and the fallout, it's an interesting paradox, Chris, because E.T. was probably a greater success than anybody could have anticipated, including Spielberg himself. And he had his battles with Jaws. Getting that made seemed to be a very arduous task. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I'd like to know how you feel about it, but for me, it's a complete misfire. I believe it was released in 1977, and Star Wars buried it at the box office. I often think about Spielberg's perspective. Jaws is such a huge success.
Well, Jaws is what opened his options for him. Jaws is what got him.
Because he had movies before Jaws that didn't do the business that Jaws did.
Yeah, Jaws got him E.T.
Okay. So he does Jaws 75, and he is standing on top of the mountain as having made the greatest box office success of all time. It was shown out at the Dryden Theater in Rochester, and it was introduced. The woman said, "This is the first summer blockbuster movie." And she went into explaining why she considers it that. So Spielberg's on top in 75 and 76, and then George Lucas comes along, delivers Star Wars, another unlikely hit, and all of a sudden Spielberg is second fiddle. And I think, what was Steven Spielberg's attitude about that? He releases Close Encounters in 77, if I'm not mistaken, and Star Wars demolishes it. And then Spielberg goes back, re-edits Close Encounters, and releases it again in 1980. And when he releases it in 1980, George Lucas is now releasing The Empire Strikes Back, which, again, is a huge success, and Close Encounters becomes somewhat irrelevant by comparison. So the way I've heard this story is that Spielberg invites Lucas to Hawaii. They're on vacation together. I imagine them sitting on a beach, and Spielberg has the attitude of, if I can't beat him, I'm going to join him, and asks George Lucas, what would you like to do next? And Lucas begins to talk about a comic book that he had when he was a kid of Scrooge McDuck, and Scrooge taking his nephews arrowhead hunting in New Mexico. They're in a cave, and they see a little emerald idol on a table-like structure, and they're about to grab at the kids, and Scrooge advises them against it, and they proceed on through the cave. And then the goons that are following them take that idol, and it triggers the giant boulder that we know so well from Raiders. And Spielberg says, I know that comic book. I had that when I was a kid. Okay, so that was sort of the touchstone to set the wheels in motion for Raiders. And so at the same time that E.T. exceeds the expectation, the video game has a greater fallout and failure than the designer and Atari and anybody that had anything to do with it could have anticipated, because like you said, it's the game that broke Atari. Would Nintendo have taken over the top spot anyway, or did E.T. really, the E.T. video game, did that really usher that along? Because I had the same feelings, Chris. I wanted that game to be as fun as the movie was, and it delivered nothing. I mean, it was frustrating. There was no excitement. I can't even remember the day that we got it, but it probably was the same for you and your brother as it was for my brother and myself. We're at KB Toy or wherever. We buy the thing. We can't wait to get home and start playing that. And then probably over the course of 20 minutes, we begin to realize this is going nowhere. How do we make this fun? And so if this story is true, they would have mass-produced this cartridge expecting sales to be somewhere in the neighborhood of the ticket sales for the movie. And by the time people like you and I played it and realized that it was garbage, then other people were like, I'm good, I'm not going to buy this. And then they had that lot of them to get rid of. And if they dumped them in Alamogordo, the other thing I know about that town is that that's where they experimented with atomic weapons before actually using the atomic weapons on Japan. So I can imagine that there's a giant crater out there in New Mexico that was caused by a bomb, and the E.T. game goes into that atomic crater. Now, the E.T. commercial, I'd like to know what you think about that. And this has become a trend where Groundhog Day just had a commercial, Back to the Future had a commercial like that, Ferris Bueller, and E.T. I don't know that there's any other, but what are your thoughts or feelings about bringing that back, or everything's at risk of being remade?
So I did a whole video on this. I always wanted to know, what happened to everybody from the movie, but at the same time, I didn't think that I wanted to see a sequel for E.T. Like, E.T. was perfect how it was. It didn't need a sequel. So, but seeing that again, obviously, it tore at my heartstrings as soon as you see Elliot and E.T. and then they're flying in the trees and then he hugs them at the end and stuff like that. So I watched it a few times too. It was a great commercial. Probably one of the best commercials I've ever seen. But yeah, I don't think that they.
And what are they selling in that commercial?
It was
cable connection or something?
Yeah, cable connection. I forget which one it was. X something.
Xfinity?
Yeah, Xfinity.
Okay.
But then I started wondering, E.T. travels all this way, meets Elliot when he was a little boy, and then he leaves, then he comes all the way back, sees him again, meets his kids, meets his family, they all fall in love with him. Then he leaves again.
Yeah.
Is he going to come back when Elliot's 80? Every 40 years?
Yeah, not much of a visit.
Yeah. So I'm like, I don't know. So yeah, I'm torn between it because I'm so glad that I could see it, and now the younger generation gets to see it. Because I was just talking about this with some friends. We were basically talking about Star Wars and stuff, but it applies to ET. So I think that I mean, I think everybody like should watch these movies. They're great movies, but the times are so different now than they were when we were young.
Yeah.
I mean, everything. So technology, the way the world works, everything is different. So for somebody to watch a movie like E.T. or Cloak and Dagger or Star Wars now, if they were born in the last 15 to 20 years, it's not going to be the same as it was for us, because they're going to start questioning, like, why are they walking around with walkie-talkies? Just use your cell phone. Like,
Right.
they don't know any different. They've been around it ever since they were born.
Right.
We are at that age where we were born with, I remember when we got our first microwave, our first VCR, our,
Yeah.
cell phones didn't exist. If you wanted to take a movie, you had to get either a movie film camera, or, if you were rich enough or you knew somebody, you could get a camcorder, which were pretty new. Video games were ColecoVisions, Commodore 64s, and Ataris until Nintendo came out.
Yeah.
So, like, the times were different. So if somebody's watching the original Star Wars, they're watching it. Yeah, they're watching it. Or they're watching the original, like, the E.T. or whatever. But they're not watching it from the 1980 point of view. Right. They're watching it from the present point of view. And I don't think that they can ever draw... And it makes me wonder now. It's like, wait... So does that mean I can never truly understand some of the other movies from my parents' generation? Probably.
But at the same time, E.T. can unlock those movies for you, because you can now look at movies from the 40s and 50s and take yourself out of your own era,
right,
and look at it as if you were a teenager or something in a different decade. Interesting comments there that generate a whole bunch of other thoughts for me. When you're talking about Star Wars, and we have since the beginning of this conversation, in one of those Star Wars movies that came out between 1999 and 2005, there's like the Senate and whatever species of creature that E.T. is represented in a booth there. So it does connect the worlds of Star Wars with our world.
Well, Spielberg and Lucas were friends, and I think that it was agreed that that Spielberg would use those Star Wars characters in the movie,
yeah,
as an homage to Lucas.
Yeah.
And before I forget, Harrison Ford was filmed in that movie. He was a principal, and they cut the entire scene out.
In E.T.?
In E.T. Harrison Ford is in the original cut of E.T., but they cut him out. So you never see his face, you only hear his voice. As Elliot got in trouble, he had to go see the principal because he let all the frogs out. He had to see the principal. The principal is Harrison Ford.
I never knew that, Chris.
So that is the connection. I didn't want to interrupt you earlier, but
no,
that was
I love
the
it.
connection between the marriage.
Yeah, the screenwriter was Harrison Ford's wife.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was just thinking about...
Another thing that I didn't know for all these years, the voice of E.T. was an old lady. She's since died, but they didn't want anyone to know that, I think, for many, many, many years. They didn't want... So I think it was an uncredited thing.
So I love the Harrison Ford information. I've been thinking about Harrison Ford. I've been watching Blade Runner lately, and I'm so impressed with Harrison Ford's 3 years between 1980 and 1983. I mean, Empire Strikes Back is my favorite of the Star Wars movies, as I believe it is for a lot of people. Yeah. Goes from that to Raiders of the Lost Ark and begins the legacy of Indiana Jones. 1982 is Blade Runner, and watching that these past couple of weeks, I'm so impressed with the vision of Blade Runner, and to think that he goes Empire, Raiders, Blade Runner, just those 3 years right there, and E.T. is within that time frame. So he's just making one excellent film after another. And then, if you wanted to extend that into 1983, you've got Return of the Jedi. I do want to make sure that we talk about the dissection scene in unifying the worlds of E.T. and Star Wars through that return favor where Lucas pays tribute to Spielberg by including the E.T. beings in the Star Wars movies. I mean, that really does hitch the universes, the galaxies, because E.T. visits our world of Earth, and he's also in the worlds of Star Wars. It's a very narrow pathway, but it's there. The other part that works in a similar way is when Han Solo goes out to retrieve Luke Skywalker on the planet Hoth, and he says, one of the soldiers says, your tauntaun will freeze before you reach the first marker. Han Solo says, well, then I'll see you in hell. And it's the only reference to Christianity, heaven and hell, in this universe that deals with the Force, which I've been told is related to Taoism. But it's the only moment where there's any religious reference other than that of the Force. So these tiny little links that are there, fascinating stuff. So with the dissection scene, and it does lead me up to, I guess, kind of the big question for me, or where I feel like this is going in terms of what it means to you. I know that part of your passion and a lot of what you're about is vegan lifestyle and compassion for animals. And the scene in school with the frog dissection is the scene that I remember the most. It moves me the most when I watch it. There's so many great things about it. The way that E.T. is at home. I think he's drinking, right? He's drinking alcohol and gets drunk. But he's also watching movies. And the movie in which it's a black and white movie, and the girl's leaving out the door and the guy pulls her back in, and Elliot is doing the same movements with his classmate. Everything about that is so on point for me. And I remember wishing that I could have a day like that at school, that I could do something outstanding, that I could be the hero in the way that Elliot is the hero there. And there's so many different layers to it. There is the animal rights issue that comes up. The girl is Erica
Eleniak.
Yeah, who later became a Playboy model and had a couple other film roles. But
Well, Drew Barrymore was also in Playboy.
True. And it's crazy to think about that, of where they would go in their young adult life. But like the way she's dressed is the way the girls in my elementary school were dressed, with those plaid dresses and those patent leather shoes, and everything about that is the time machine that you were talking about in the beginning. And so at the heart of this story, and what you'd said earlier on about Spielberg explaining the character and the emotion to Henry Thomas of the alien is like your dog. So what is the alien? What is E.T.? If it's a metaphor, what is it representing? What does it represent to you? You know, we talked about Spielberg using E.T. as a way to come to terms with his parents' divorce. One of the emotions that I associate with it, or that I relate to with it, is my parents were getting divorced around that time, and my father moved to California. And when Elliot has to say goodbye to E.T., the feeling that I get from the movie is very similar to the feeling that I had having to say goodbye to my father, who was going to California. What is it for you, and does it connect with your beliefs surrounding animal rights, or is it separate from that, or how do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think you just said it. Like, he makes the connection with the frogs. He's drawing pictures of ET, and then he realizes that the frogs kind of look like ET, and he loves ET, and he would never want to hurt ET, so he makes that connection and doesn't want to hurt the frogs, so he frees them all, and that's a connection towards compassion so long ago.
That's
I
it,
mean,
Chris.
they all have it there. When they say goodbye at the end, to me, that's like, that crushes me, because that's like almost the same as somebody dying. You know that the chances are that you will never see your friend again. Like, this is that at the end of that scene. That's, you're like, they're crying, and that's it. He's like, come, stay, and then he's gone, and you know that, and that's why you're crying, because you know that that's a goodbye forever, pretty much.
And for us to see that when we're 5 and 6 years old, right? That is such a heavy life lesson, that there will be these moments in our lives. It was almost like a prophecy or a foretelling or something, that the hardest moments in our lives, and I don't mean to speak for you, but I think that some of the hardest things that anyone could go through is a separation, whether it be a death or a divorce or distance. That's a fact of life that I think is universal. And the other side of it that you just commented on is the compassion, and it's sort of like the one is the remedy for the other. Feeling that compassion for ET, feeling the compassion for the frogs, feeling the compassion and the open heart for anything, is part of the most powerful message that comes through from that movie, that I hadn't really considered it in those terms until we broke it down and investigated it through this conversation. I didn't want this conversation to be scripted, because I wanted to sort of find our way through it. What would we arrive at through this conversation? Because I knew that it meant a great deal to you, and it means a good deal to me as well. But when I think about the bottom line of this being compassion, and having to come to terms with separations and being removed from those that we care about, I feel like in its incredibly unique way, that's what that film does.
Well, consider this. In the movie, we were attached to it because we're watching the movie back in 1982. And we identify with Elliot. So we are suspending our reality and the outside world, and we are trying to live through Elliot's eyes.
Yeah.
And what unfolds on that few days with Halloween and everything in between is something so magnificent, something so amazing, and then it just ends. So it's hard to think that anything later in life is ever going to rival that experience. And for me, as a kid, knowing that experience and the experience that I vicariously had through that movie, through Elliot,
Right.
that's why that might be a reason why I'm so in love with this movie, and I get that sense, a strong, I can't even come up with the right words, a strong sense of nostalgia when I think about this movie, because like I said, it's not just about the movie, it's about me as a kid, everything that was going on at the time when I watched this movie, and everything, all of those emotions that come right back to me as soon as I start watching this movie, as soon as I start hearing the sounds, the crickets in the wooded area above the city. The music is amazing, John Williams. It just all brings everything back precisely. And it brings back quick memories for me that I can't even explain in words. Feelings that I have that are, I guess, they're mine, and hopefully, I'm sure. I mean, obviously, other people have these too, but I'm sure other people can get the same thing. But I don't know. I don't really. I guess since we're really getting deep in this, I'll admit this. So I don't really talk about this because it's kind of weird. People think of me differently. But with all honesty, like I don't really have too many emotions like most people do. So the one emotion that I really have that's very strong for me is the sense of nostalgia. And I had a good childhood, so like going back to those times, like I'm a very sentimental person too. So like I I know those times are right there in the back of my head. I can go there whenever I want. But at the same time, those in reality, they're gone forever. So ET is something that can bring that out in me where I have intense emotions of nostalgia of all the things I remember. And I have a really, really good memory. I remember so many things with almost a precise is photographic memory of things that were happening. So yeah, that's
I would second that 100%, Chris. As you're talking about it, I'm thinking about it as a life changing
oh for sure.
moment when we were young and saw E.T. I would say the first thing that happened for me was, and I'm only able to articulate this because of the way you said it, is when we sit down to watch E.T. for the first time, there is enough about Elliot and his experience and his clothes and his candy and his toys and his figures of speech that we trade places with him. He becomes our representative, our champion, and we are, as you said, seeing the world through Elliot's eyes. So different than any other movie, you feel transported into the film. I think that's the feeling that you and I got on that initial viewing, is that once we identified with Elliot, we identified with him completely, so that it was almost as if this life-changing experience was happening to us. And then life would never be the same after that. It was as if we were visited by an alien. We talk about the suspension of disbelief. Yeah, we were completely on board. And I definitely want to make sure that we comment on magical realism. Magical realism is my favorite genre of literature. We're here in Jake Patterson's library, and a lot of the books on that shelf over there are magical realism, and that's part of how he and I found a connection. We like a lot of the same literature, and we're working on a book, and there are some magical realism pieces within it. I first heard about magical realism from Paul Avila's literature professor at OCC, and I was interested because I didn't know what it was. It was not fantasy or sci-fi. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is credited as the front runner, maybe even the inventor of the genre. And reading about E.T. not that long ago, I read that it includes elements of magical realism, namely the bikes flying. And when that happened, I mean, I'm also with you in regards to being a nostalgic person, a sentimental person, and a person who has a very vivid memory. And people tell me that I can remember things in great detail from when I was very young. My brother comments on it about my ability to remember things from when I'm 2, and there's another author. My favorite living author is Daniel Wallace, and he came up here 2 years ago, and we met and we talked, and we've been pen pals for a while. And he told me about a technique of remembering things called the memory palace technique. And you probably already do this, Chris, where the concept is, if you're remembering a house that you were in when you were 5, you remember that there was a candlestick on a table, and you visualize that candlestick, and that becomes the key to unlocking the rest of the memory. So you walk into the palace, you see the candle on the table, then you see the table, you see the floor, you follow the floor to the wall, you see the wallpaper, and all of a sudden you're back in that moment. Once Daniel Wallace told me about that, I realized that that's part of the technique that I employ. And I know when and why I decided to develop my memory. I feel like it is a muscle that can get stronger. When I was 13, my best friend moved away to Arizona, and I was sad about it. Probably more sad than I should have been, or more sad than what was considered normal. And what I wanted more than anything was to be able to go back a year and relive the year that I had just lived, and all of the basketball games and stickball games and video games and sneakers and art classes and everything that was good about it. It was like just a wonderful childhood experience, and it was gone, and I wanted it back. And once I realized that there was no DeLorean, there was no time machine, there was no option to go back, I realized that the closest thing to time travel was being able to remember the moments of our lives in sharp detail. So from that moment forward, I told myself to pay attention to the details, so that if I ever did want to revisit a moment, I would be able to recall it, and recall what color the walls were, and recall what scent was in the park where they filmed E.T. And really make the memories something that I could relive. So a couple other things that I wanted to get out, and I definitely appreciate you making the time to talk about this. It's been incredible hearing your thoughts on this. At the time that E.T. was released, there were some products that were available. There wasn't anything quite like the Star Wars action figures. They never really capitalized on the popularity of it. I remember there was a stuffed animal E.T. doll, about this big, and it didn't really look like E.T. I mean, it was sort of like everybody was scrambling to get a product out that they could make some quick money on. One of the things that I did see a lot of were stickers and buttons, like pins. One of my favorite TV shows is Taxi. Do you remember Taxi with Christopher Lloyd as cab driver? Danny DeVito was in it.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, I didn't really watch it, but I know what it is.
So there's an episode of it, probably several episodes of it, because it was on the air in '82, and Christopher Lloyd, Dr. Emmett Brown, he wears what they call a Canadian tuxedo, denim jacket, denim pants, and he has a button that says, "I saw E.T." And this was sort of a promotional thing at the time, where it had the two layers of, I saw the movie, but it's also kind of like playing into the idea that you had an encounter with E.T. And I was wondering if there's any sort of pop culture recollections that you have about the success and it being everywhere, and any item that you can think of. I asked my students the other day if they had seen E.T., and most of their hands went up. And it was reassuring to me that kids today are at least aware of it. Then one girl said, and I'm sure you've heard this throughout the years, that E.T. freaked her out and that she was scared of it, and that the design can sometimes be frightening to some people. So there's two questions there, at least. One is, what sort of products and pop culture reaction do you recall, or what stands out to you about the success at the time, and what are your thoughts on the look of E.T. and whether or not it's frightening? And I do have one other thing that I'd like to add to the conversation before we wrap it up, but I'll just leave it at those two for now.
Okay, so yeah, I get that a lot too. People say they didn't want to watch E.T. because they were too frightened of them. And I guess the first time they show E.T., like, I guess that could be a very scary part, but, you know, very shortly after, it's obvious that, you know, there's a big connection, and he's not dangerous. He's a friendly being.
Right.
So that, I mean, obviously, if he was trying to eat him and kill him, that would be scary, but that's not the case.
Right.
So anybody that thought that E.T. was a scary movie, I urge you to go back and watch it again. It's such a heartwarming story, and some of the things that, let's see, we had a mask, and I was just actually trying to go through and find a picture, because there's a picture of me wearing the mask maybe a year or two after it came out, with my dad and my uncle on each side of me, and we're all holding a rotary phone door, and we're basically saying phone home.
Yeah.
I'll try to find that picture for you sometime and
Okay.
show you that. And I remember having actually there's another picture of me at a birthday party, and I'm wearing, you know, the baseball cut shirt. Actually, I'm wearing a baseball cut shirt right now, but one of these ones.
Oh yeah.
And it's the yellow sleeves, and it's an E.T. shirt.
Awesome.
And I have that one picture of me wearing that E.T. shirt, and then the picture of me wearing the mask. Now that mask, my dad went out and bought that at Sears for $20 back in 1982.
Rubber mask?
It's a rubber mask that you put over. It's a big E.T. mask.
Okay.
And we've had that, and every year he like puts it on a little dummy and puts it out there for Halloween. And we even had like he had an RV. It was like a old 70s RV that he got pretty cheap, and it would just sit in our driveway, and he put him in the passenger seat with E.T. looking out. People would be like, "Oh my god!" And you know,
That's awesome.
Sorry, I missed that.
Oh. Siri tried to get in our podcast. So the other thing I was going to say was, in one of my recent videos over the holidays, I learned from my dad, who said that he had just thrown that mask away. And I'm like, no, you got to be kidding me.
Does he know what this movie means to you?
Yeah, and he threw it away. And I just found the VHS tape. I have the original VHS tape that I just found.
Does it have a green
yeah.
guard
Yeah.
on there? Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
that too.
So I have that one, and but he threw that mask away, and I was
Why,
like,
Dad?
But you can see the actual unscripted video of me finding out. It's all on my YouTube channel.
Oh, dude.
So I was, yeah. So, but before I forget, so those are a couple of things
Yeah, that's great.
that I remember, and also huge with the Reese's Pieces. That basically was everywhere. Reese's Pieces got their boost, and everybody was buying Reese's Pieces, not M&Ms.
Yep. And the popularity of Reese's Pieces, I don't think, has ever returned to the scale that it was
With E.T.
With E.T.
With E.T. The other thing that I, totally off topic, but still on E.T. topic, was the way that Spielberg set the scene, and several scenes, but that specific scene in the kitchen dining room where they're all in there at the beginning, and you know, he grabs the knife and goes, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll check it out." And he goes outside to see if the coyote's back. The way that scene is lit with the fogginess and everything, it just, that brings me right back there. And a couple movies did that well, actually. And I think Steven Spielberg was overseeing the movie, but I think J.J. Abrams directed Super 8, but there's a scene where they're all at the, you know, kitchen table, and it kind of recreates it.
Yeah, it does.
And it had my attention for a quick minute.
Right.
I didn't like the overall movie, but that scene, yes. And then the other series that kind of captures this is Stranger Things.
Yep.
And other than that, there's really been nothing over the years. I've always
You're
been
talking about the atmosphere?
the atmosphere of E.T. Yeah.
and that atmosphere relates to the atmosphere of your childhood
My childhood
in this area.
and also just something really struck a nerve when I watched that in the theater, because that scene, all the scenes, but specifically that
With the
scene
fog, you're saying?
where they're all in there, they're eating pizza. And did they actually get the pizza? No, that was all they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that scene is, that brings me right back. Like I said, that documentary Spielberg, you gotta watch it. They show so many other scenes, like for instance, they show a scene what he does when all of the government officials have taken over the house and everything, and everybody's in the driveway. There's people in suits going up the driveway, down the driveway, and then his friends are down at the bottom of the driveway on their bikes. And Spielberg set this scene up like, the script. In the script, there's only 3 words. He says something, and to the other kid, and he says something back. I forget what he says to him, but just for those 3 words from that script, Spielberg had a camera go from all the way up to show everything that was going on with this. He followed some of the people walking down in the suits all the way down to get to the kid, to frame the kid where he asks him the question.
Right.
Basically, like, oh, you're gonna die, like something like that.
Yeah, and I think it's Spielberg's finest hour. I mean, Spielberg will go down in history arguably as, if not the finest filmmaker of like there's a couple people in that conversation. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock is in that conversation, but
I guess when Spielberg was really young, he would sneak into was it Universal or Warner Brothers? I forget. He would sneak in and watch Hitchcock direct.
Right.
Until he was like finally, and he would just do it like he was supposed to be there for school or whatever.
Right.
And finally, I think he did get kicked out once, but that's how he got his start. He just started
hanging out.
Yeah.
And I've been told that the birds flying overhead at the end of Jaws is Spielberg's nod to Hitchcock. So there's definitely an influence there.
Well, he also uses the Hitchcock zoom when Roy Scheider is sitting there on the beach.
Yep.
And it's the zoom where you're zooming out as you're going in, or you're going out as you're zooming in.
Yep.
I do it all the time with my camera. It looks really weird.
It is a cool effect.
Yeah.
And Hitchcock probably does it in a lot of films, but I'm thinking Vertigo is the one where that's really the trademark look. Okay, so Spielberg and the atmosphere, it just seems so effortless with E.T., where there isn't a misstep. It's almost like the whole project was guided, and I feel like Blade Runner is another film like that. E.T., we experienced it very early on in our lives, where we weren't film critics the way we are now. Like we can pick apart what made that movie so great from a production point of view, from an acting point of view, from a storytelling point of view. But when we were kids, it was just excellent. It just affected us. The other thing that I wanted to comment on here was, we've talked about a couple of coincidences throughout the evening, and one of them is in 2018, I went out to Chicago to help the homeless, and I was inspired to go to Chicago because I read a fascinating nonfiction book about the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, which is when Nikola Tesla lights it with AC current. Milton Hershey buys the machines that make it possible for him to produce chocolate in an affordable way to the everyday person instead of just the wealthy. And it made me want to see Chicago, and specifically the area where that 1893 World's Fair was held. And it was a bunch of buildings, A lot of them caught on fire and were destroyed. The only building remaining is now the Museum of Science and Industry. And it's a fascinating museum. They have a captured Nazi submarine in there and a lot of great exhibits. But one thing that caught my interest, and I know it caught yours as well, is the phone apparatus from E.T. And I don't know if it was the one that was actually used in the film, but it looks spot on. And it has the Texas Instruments Speak and Spell. It has the umbrella, the coffee can, the record player. I mean, this is such a legit museum that has a history that I wouldn't be surprised if that is the actual movie prop. I mean, if Dee Wallace's dress ends up in a video store.
Yeah, very well could be.
Right? And so that was something that you noticed. And then you commented that my style, the hat that I typically wear, and other things about my style that are just sort of there, are very much like one of the kids in the gang. And
I sent you that picture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said, like...
That's the park that I was at, too, by the way.
Oh, that's so awesome. And I looked at it. I mean, I don't know if we had a split screen of the kid in the movie and myself, but I was like, wow, this is not planned, but it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't like just the hat, whether the kid wore sunglasses or the jacket or whatever, but that feels like that is my look or something without me really consciously trying to have a look. It's just, I didn't notice that, but it definitely fit. It definitely rang true. So just so many things about that movie, and it was definitely in my mind as I was driving around New Mexico, and I appreciate the correspondence with you, and I knew that it would be interesting to have a conversation and to really investigate for you what it was that made that movie without a doubt your favorite, and what it was that was special and magical about it. And I think we did a pretty good job of mining that territory and really unearthing what it is that makes E.T. the unforgettable experience that it was and will continue to be.
I think, before I forget, I think that the kids that in the movie, at least because he dealt with like a lot of kid actors, and movies aren't normally filmed like this, especially Hollywood movies, chronological order. Most movies are filmed out of chronological order, but this was all in chronological order because he needed the kids to understand where they're getting their reaction from, where they're going to act from, of what's going on. They couldn't just have Henry Thomas be all sad at the beginning of the movie and then like not know why.
Okay.
So because they were so young, it was all filmed in chronological order, which is pretty crazy.
It is crazy, and to think of where it fits in Spielberg's filmography. So the film that comes before that would have to be Raiders of the Lost Ark, 81, right?
Year before, yeah.
I mean, he was producing movies left and right.
Yeah.
So even movies that he didn't direct, he had a hand in producing.
Poltergeist,
Gremlins, I believe he produced it. And
Gremlins is another one of my favorite movies.
We had such a hall of fame of movies that we maybe took it for granted, or maybe we were fortunate to be born at that time. They don't make movies
like that anymore.
They don't. And we heard people make comments like that when we were kids of, they don't make music like this anymore, or whatever it might have been, but it really was a golden era of films, and it was a great time to be a kid, where year in and year out you had E.T., Goonies, Stand By Me, the laundry list that you just mentioned, Back to the Future. And my experience was growing up across the street from the Hollywood Theater. My mom had no problem sending me over there, and these movies were mostly PG, so it was okay for me to watch them. and I would come home blue in the face trying to explain to my mom the magic that just happened in that room across the street. You know, it's just a big old room, and yet something like these bicycles flying in front of the moon, or the kids finding a pirate ship, or seeing a dead body, or traveling back in time. And I wanted my mom to be as excited as I was, and to have her mind blown like mine was. And you know, her reaction was just sort of, "That's nice, Josh." You know, but she wasn't there, and
She didn't realize what was happening. History was we were being sculpted.
Yeah.
That was our being. Like that. Like without ET, like I'd probably be a little bit of a different person.
I'm sure you would be.
Another, since you're talking about moms now, I just found another connection. My mom's favorite singer, musician was Neil Diamond, and when this came out, he did Heartlight. He did the song Heartlight for ET. It wasn't in the
Didn't know
movie,
that.
but it was all.
So this is where I was getting an education, and I knew that I would from you, because I knew how serious you are about your projects, and if you love this movie this much, you're gonna know things about it that I didn't know, like the Harrison Ford thing, like this Neil Diamond thing. It's just, it's awesome, Chris. Uh, what a great film, what a great experience. Uh, I think we're just fortunate to have been kids when we were, and to have that. And that movie stands alone. There's really no other movie quite like it. It's a once in a lifetime film, and it's crazy to think that may not be the movie that Spielberg is remembered for. I mean, he may be remembered for Schindler's List. He may be
Jurassic
Park or something, which doesn't do much for me. I mean, there's some Spielberg movies. I'm not a pure Steven Spielberg fan. I'm a real fan of that movie, and that movie does so many things, like that scene with the frogs. That scene alone is a tribute to movies themselves, where E.T. is getting this education through movies, and Explorers tried to retread some of that ground, where those aliens, all they knew of humans was what they had picked up on their transmissions and movies, and saw how aliens were treated in science fiction films. George and I are in the process of publishing a book, and there will be more after the first one that we publish. And one of the stories that I'm working on is inspired by Explorers, and is designed in the spirit of stories like E.T. and Explorers. Without going too far off topic, but to again show a parallel and a interesting coincidence. The story that I'm writing has to do with a man who builds a spaceship in his backyard based on a dream that he had, and his friend had the same dream, and they're students at Clarkson, they're engineering students, and they begin to wonder if they could in fact turn a 1915 Curtiss Jenny biplane into a space-worthy craft. Retrofit it, make it capable of leaving the Earth's atmosphere. They take it on as a side project. Could it be done? If it can be dreamed of, can it be a reality? And he flies this ship that he built in his backyard to the moon. Part of the idea was born out of listening to the REM song Man on the Moon, and the line, "Are we losing touch?" And it also has to do with family, and how he becomes so obsessed with his project that he neglects his children. And the neglected children set into motion a series of events that create a huge disaster. And so his destination is the moon. Heading to Philadelphia tomorrow, and it's their theater week. And I was looking at the plays that are that are on down in Philadelphia, and there's a play about a guy who builds a spaceship in his backyard and flies it to the moon.
What?
That's what I mean, Chris. It's like this play is about a Palestinian who feels that Palestine should have a space program and is inspired by the 1969 moon landing. But when I read the synopsis online, I thought, how specific is that of a guy building a spaceship in his backyard and flying it to the moon? Now, I'm not going to scrap my idea because there's so much about my idea that is different than that, but it reminds me of the chair that you were talking about, and how the chair that you bought was bought from the house that you would later purchase. Just a unique coincidence, and I find that those kind of coincidences happen all the time. But I don't know. E.T. is inspiring on so many levels that I feel like it'd be worth it to endeavor to make a film that captures, or even tries to capture, some of what E.T. captured, because there's really nothing like it. And in designing this story, I thought, I'm working off the principle of, I want to write a story that is the type of story that I would enjoy reading. And it would fit into that genre of magical realism. Flying a plane to the moon is as unbelievable as the bicycles taking off during the chase. And it's also based on an experience I had when I was a kid. The happiest, most exciting experience of my childhood, and probably of my life, is that my bus driver lived on my block on the opposite side of the street, and he was a World War II fighter pilot, and he had a bi-wing airplane, looked like the Red Baron plane from Snoopy or whatever, and it was red, and he had a German Shepherd named Princess, and he said that he would take my brother and I up in his airplane, but he could only take one of us at a time because it was so small. And my mother was always trying to get some sleep. She was a night nurse. And when Mr. Van Buren said that he would take us up in the airplane, I ran home across the street, tugged on my mom's shirt sleeve, and said, Mom, can I go in Mr. Van Buren's airplane? And she was half asleep. She said, yeah, sure, just let me sleep longer. Go back over to Mr. Van Buren's house, takes us to the airfield. Sure enough, we take off. We're flying above Syracuse. And we're doing maneuvers like this, up and down, and we see the Carrier Dome. And he said, do you know what that is? And I didn't at the time. I was 8. And he said, let's get a closer look. And we dive bomb it like this. And if this arm of this couch is the roof of the Carrier Dome, we come down like this and pull up at the last minute. And the G-forces are pulling me back in the cockpit of the airplane. The German Shepherd is right there next to me. I mean, it was just that exhilarating. And so he began building a second airplane in his backyard, and the second one was silver. And
wait, what did your mom say when she woke up? Was she okay with it?
Yeah, she was okay with it. Mr. Van Buren was a good guy, and he served with my grandfather in the war. And my mom is a pretty laid back mom, and being a single parent mom, she was very much like the Dee Wallace character, trying to keep it together. And she had no issue with it. And I was also super excited about it because I got to go first, and then my older brother Eric got to go the next day or whenever his turn came. So this story that I've mentioned some of the pieces of, it's inspired by Explorers because I love that movie, and as you know, the boys in that movie have a shared dream, which then leads to the design of that blue sphere that allows them to travel through space.
I have to see that movie again. It's been such a long time since I've seen it. So.
And I think you'll see the traces of E.T. in it, where Joe Dante was no slouch. I mean, he has some excellent movies. Gremlins. So Joe Dante is riding off the success of Gremlins '84, and like the game designer of E.T., he has said that Explorers is not what he wanted it to be, that he was rushed to get it done and out by a deadline, and probably for the same reason that the game designer was, that we want to capitalize on the interest in E.T. We want to give the market another movie. If you liked E.T., you'll probably like Explorers. And just before coming over here tonight, I was looking up the screenwriter, Matheson, and she did a segment of the Twilight Zone remake, the segment that Spielberg directed, Kick the Can. And I thought that was also pretty interesting, how everything seems to find its way through the Twilight Zone. All like the 6 degrees of separation, like everything can work through the Twilight Zone.
Well, Rod Serling is from here.
Absolutely. Syracuse, Christmas Day.
Yep.
He was born here. And when you talk about nostalgia and the time machine of these movies, my favorite episode of the Twilight Zone is called Walking Distance, and a man is getting an oil change, and he walks into town while his car is being worked on, and it's his hometown, and it's actually Binghamton, New York, because Serling, although born here, grew up there.
And he talks about like Binghamton, Cortland, Elmira,
Saratoga,
Syracuse.
You said Cortland, Buffalo. Yeah, he's referencing upstate New York a lot in the Twilight Zone. And as the man's walking into his hometown, he happens to travel back in time 25 years and sees himself as a 12-year-old. And there's a whole thing with a carousel there, and there is a carousel in Binghamton, and it's painted with scenes of the Twilight Zone. And they celebrated 50 years of the Twilight Zone 10 years ago at the television studio in Binghamton. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend it. Serling's widow, who recently passed away, and his 2 daughters were there. And I had a graphic novel of that episode, and it's a picture of Rod Serling on the back page, and I had his daughters sign it next to his picture and his widow. And when I handed it to her, it's similar to your encounter with Dee Wallace. She said, "Oh, do you like this episode?" I said, "I love it. It's my favorite." And she said, "Rod really liked it too." And everything that I've heard and seen in interviews and read is that Rod was displeased with it and was not satisfied with the actor's performance and rewrote it as a different episode called A Stop at Willoughby. But you know that one?
Yep.
Carol, his widow, told me something personal about Rod and that episode and where it comes from, which I think does connect to this conversation about E.T. She said that Rod's father died of a heart attack while he was in the war. He ran a deli in Binghamton, and he was stressed out financially and had a heart attack and died. And Rod never got to say goodbye to him and never got to see his father be proud of him for his service or anything like that. So when Rod is in his adult life and is successful with his writing career and television career, he would take a shoebox full of photographs of himself and his father. And I've seen photos of you and your father. And he would take a blanket and put it out in the front yard of their home down in Ithaca. And he would go through these photos of himself and his father and cry. And she said that episode is about him missing his father and missing that time of his childhood, just like we're talking about with E.T. And in that episode, the central character is sitting there having to come to terms with the disaster that he has caused, and his father shows up and talks to him, and the gist of it and the bottom line of what he says, what the father says to his son is, "I know you're not from this time. you're from somewhere else, and is it so bad where you're from? And he said, I thought so, Pop. And he said, I needed to come back here to hear a band concert and ride the carousel and hear the calliope and eat some cotton candy and all these things that he associated with his childhood, like the things that you and I associate with our childhood. And the father's advice to the son is, maybe there are band concerts where you are. You've been looking behind you. Try looking ahead. And that's the optimistic word of advice that the father, who is no longer reachable, says to him through this magical realism of the Twilight Zone. And these summers, I'm the announcer at the community band concerts down in Skinny Atlas, and there's a gazebo, and it's very much the same scene. And I quote that passage from the Twilight Zone, with Serling being a local guy and all of that legend. But I feel like it is comforting, to think about the fact that our lives have always been wonderful. There's always been sadness and disappointment. You talked about the richness of the emotions that E.T. brings out for you. The moments that you have to smile at, the moments that you have to cry at. And that's the way life is. That it won't just be the sadness. It won't just be the parting ways. There will be moments of hilarity. There will be moments of compassion. There will be failures and setbacks and all of that kind of stuff. But stories like E.T. or that episode of Walking Distance, they perform this vital function that I feel is the best that art can do, is to give us the encouragement to press on and to take the next step forward through life. And I think it's okay to be nostalgic and to hop in that time machine and go back to when we were 5 and 6 and the effect that the E.T. had on us. But we also have come to terms with the fact that we can't live in that time machine, and we can't watch this movie too often, and we have to live our lives, and we have to be in the present. But it's a lot better with artwork like E.T. in it. It makes life more enjoyable and more endurable and more worthwhile. It just enriched the whole experience for us in a monumental way. And on some level, everybody felt that when E.T. came out. But for some of us, like you and me, it made an impact that really changed our lives. And that's what I heard you say that first time that we talked, when you said, that's my favorite movie. I could tell that it meant more to you than most people. And now I think we've probably covered it A to Z. There's always going to be more that we can say about it, but I wanted to know more of what that meant to you, and I feel like that came out in this conversation. So just wanted to thank you for making the time to be here, and I'm glad that Jake was so accommodating and setting us up here, and that we have the record of it.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun talking about E.T. with somebody that can appreciate it as much as I do.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Chris Cooney, it's been a pleasure. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. Let me know anytime.
Awesome, man. Thanks, Chris.